So the other day, I was going through performance check and I was checking out some of Rob's videos, and I came across one of his questions where he was talking about how were Dragonborn born. If you haven't checked out any of Rob's performance check videos, please do. It's pretty fantastic. Hashtag boost. So, but anyway, this got me thinking about Dragonborn, and I started doing some research, and oh man, I was not prepared for how deep the rabbit hole went. So if you were on Absolute Tabletop in their forums, which you should be, um, I have been kind of talking about how much research I've been doing. This is pretty much the project that I've been working on. Um, ugh, I apologize for not putting out a lot of videos, but this has kind of eaten up a lot of my time. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Out of Character. I'm your host, the Faulty GM, and today I have a conspiracy theory for you, specifically about the Dragonborn that I want to share with you guys. So, gather your tinfoil hats, close your blinds, and let's discuss. So, before we get into the details, know that this is obviously just a theory. This is just what I'm talking about. I'm going to try to put all the references and the places that I got a lot of this information in the description below so that you can formulate your own theories or follow along as I'm talking. And like always, whether or not you agree with me or agree with me, let's discuss down in the comments below. All right, so let's dive straight in. So when I first started researching Dragonborn and how they're born, I wanted to go into the roots, figure out how they were originally supposed to be, and work my way upwards. That way I could answer Rob's question. This is where I discovered that the Dragonborn have only really been around for 10 years, since the days of 3.5. However, despite their short publication history, their mythos is very, very confusing. And that's like the least you could probably say about their mythos. The main reason why their mythos is extremely confusing, though, is because their mythos is very inconsistent from 3.5 to 4E and 5E. There's just a lot of inconsistencies that you don't see with any of the other races. But in my quest to find answers, I think I pretty much have stumbled across a theory that connects all of these things and solves the inconsistencies between them. But before we get into all that, let's talk about each of the Dragonborn and how they work in their individual editions. That way we have some framework so that when I tell you my theory, it makes a little bit more sense instead of working backwards from there. So we're going to start with the Dragonborn from 3.5. So the Dragonborn in 3.5 are called Bahamut's Dragonborn, or at least the community knows them as Bahamut's Dragonborn. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but that's how I'm going to pronounce it for the rest of this video, so hopefully that doesn't drive anybody crazy if I'm pronouncing it wrong. But yeah, they're different than any of the Dragonborn you know today, unless you're super old school and you know all like the obscure books that they put out. So they originally appeared in 2006 in a 3.5 supplement called Races of the Dragon, a book that featured lore, races, character classes, and all kinds of stuff based on the draconic races. The book introduced two new classes, which would be the Spell Scales and, of course, the Dragonborn. And again, Races of the Dragon, in my opinion, I wasn't necessarily around for 3.5, but it's it seems like an obscure book. It seems like an out of the way book that like you don't really need. Not everybody probably purchased. It also had like half dragons and stuff in it, but yeah, I digress. So on page 5 of the book, so the Dragonborn are the first things that they pretty much talk about. And on page 5 of the book, it gives us a bit of the background regarding the creation of the Dragonborn, stating that Bahamut stands between Tiamat and her evil god and her evil goals. The conflict between them has raged for centuries. Those who know of this conflict refer to it as the Dragon War. Goes on to say, those willing to give themselves into Bahamut's care and act as his emissaries in the mortal realms becomes his daughters and sons. Such humanoids give up all their former and racial identity and are born anew. They become Dragonborn. So the book goes through the details of how any race can become a Dragonborn, given that they have received the call from the Platinum Dragon himself. So the call is something that not everyone gets. He doesn't reach out to everyone in the world and see what happens. He reaches out to a very select amount of individuals, and from those select amount of individuals, not everyone receives his answers his call. But for those that do answer the call, they go through this transformation into the Dragonborn, which is really weird. This is what really separates the Dragonborn from all the other races, is that the Dragonborn are not necessarily a race onto themselves that have their own type of culture. They are a transitionary race, meaning that you need to have been born into another race and become a Dragonborn afterwards. You are not born a Dragonborn. So to become a Dragonborn, you have to go through this super odd process that Bahamut guides you through. You got to spend 100 gold on a fake egg. You got to spend 24 hours fasting and sleeping and thinking about all the stuff that you're losing. And then you get to crawl into this fake egg that you created and put the lid on the fake egg somehow, or maybe have somebody seal it. It's not very clear. And then you sleep for another 24 hours, and when you wake up after those 24 hours, you break out of this fake, very expensive egg, and boom, you are a Dragonborn. So, if I'm making light of their transformation, it's because their transformation is just so weird. It's like so odd. Like, can you imagine in the middle of like a campaign, someone's like, you know what? I'm gonna become a Dragonborn. And they're like, where do I go to buy the materials to make this fake egg? It's just silly to me. But anyway, regardless of the age of the person, once their transformation is over, they are an adult Dragonborn. Now, Dragonborn live to be about 400 years old, so obviously they've reached their mid-years about 200. Again, if this is your first time ever hearing about Bahamut's Dragonborn, that might sound super weird to you, since Dragonborn only live to about the same age as humans do. But yeah, they live to about 403.5. There is no specification on the color of their scales. But if you reference the pictures in the book, there's all kinds of different colors. They're purple, they're kind of like a pale blue. Some of them are the traditional colors, like a rust color. There are all kinds of colors. Their height and weight vary. Their height and weight is based upon the height and weight of the race that they were beforehand. So originally, if you were an elf, you would be a much slender Dragonborn, taller. But you'll always be 2 inches more, or 2 inches. You'll gain 2 inches in height when you become a Dragonborn. So like if you were like 5 feet, you'll be 5'2" now. If you were 6 feet, you'll be 6'2". So if you were a dwarf, you'd be short and stocky. If you were a halfling, you'd be very small, so on and so forth. So you had these super weird Dragonborn compared to what you have today. Can you imagine like a miniature Dragonborn from a halfling? Adorable. So once the transformation is over, each new Dragonborn receives one of the 3 gifts of the Dragonborn, which is either Dragon Breath, or you can get some wings, or you can get the Mind, which is just like you can't be paralyzed, frightened, you got some dark vision stuff going on. But yeah. So let's see, what else do they have? Oh, right. So in 3.5, they also, like I said, you can't be born as Dragonborn. You can only be reborn as Dragonborn. It's a transitionary race. And the reason that once you transform into a Dragonborn, that you can't then procreate is because Bahamut sterilized you. Pretty much the Dragonborn only exist to fight the spawn of Tiamat. Tiamat produces spawn, which are kobolds, things like that. Your goal is to just outright murder them. Um, is to just kill them flat out and to fight the chromatic dragons on behalf of Bahamut. So he wants you to focus on that. He doesn't want you to focus on children. Doesn't want you to focus on love or any of that stuff. You are there to kill things. It's also worth noting that if you fail in your duties as a Dragonborn to fight Tiamat, right, or you dishonor your god in some way, he can remove the gift of being a Dragonborn, so you turn back into the race that you once were. So if you were an elf and you were a Dragonborn, you would turn back into an elf. Um, so it's a race that you can become, but that can also be removed from you, and you would go back to the race. It's also worth noting that although in none of the pictures that I saw and in none of the features mentioned, you don't have a tail, but in the book it does have. So you don't. I would say that you don't. Dragonborn don't have a tail by default, but it is possible because there are additional features that say any creature with dragon blood is capable of having a tail, as a added feature. So again, I think this is just my own estimation. There is nothing about the Dragonborn inside of their section that states they have tails, but the book makes it clear that it is possible for any dragon race to be born with a tail. So take that for what it is. The early Dragonborn could have had a tail, but most of them didn't. All right, so let's move on to the 4th edition Dragonborn. So 4th edition gets a little bit more complicated because the Forgotten Realms and 4th edition. So if you don't know, every edition, if you're new to Dungeons and Dragons, every edition has a default campaign setting. So a default campaign setting is a campaign setting that is what all the like the player's handbook, all those things, all the main books are based on. Typically, it's also what the adventures that they write, they're based in that setting. So, for example, the Forgotten Realms is probably the most famous one, the one that you know the most because it's been in most of their books, but it wasn't even the first one. So the Forgotten Realms is typically 3.5 default setting was Forgotten Realms. 4th editions was called A Point of Light, and 5th editions is a return to Forgotten Realms. Forgotten Realms is again the default setting. So the reason that it's complicated to talk about it is because when 4th edition came out, inside of its player's handbook, the Dragonborn were a main race. They were a playable race right off the bat with the first player's handbook. This was kind of a big deal because, again, they only came about one edition ago. So, and they were in a supplement. They weren't a part of the player's handbook. So to take that and then put it in here, but even then, those Dragonborn were completely different. So the reason that made it a little bit hard to compare the two is because on the surface, these two are completely different. They're not in the same reality, they're not in the same setting, and they don't look or act anything alike. But when I did more research, and I found the Forgotten Realms campaign guide and the subsequent player's handbook, or maybe the player's handbook came out before, not sure. The Dragonborn were also featured in those books. So when you look at those books, the Dragonborn are actually there, and there is no variant for the Bahamut Dragonborn, meaning there is no variant for becoming a transitionary Dragonborn, going from an elf into a Dragonborn, which, in my opinion, means that the Dragonborn in the Forgotten Realms are exactly the same as the Dragonborn from A Point of Light, not necessarily like their history or things like that, but the way they look, their features, things like that, you can pretty much copy and paste, is pretty much what they did, which makes sense. It would probably make it a little bit more complicated to try to put the Bahamut Dragonborn into 4th edition. But just so you know, going forward, we're going to be basing this off of what they look like in the point of light, but what was said about them in the Forgotten Realms. So kind of taking it from two different things to formulate the fourth edition Dragonborn. All right. With that said, let's keep going. Sorry, I keep like taking breaks to like explain all this stuff, but I just want everyone to be on the same page. So fourth edition Dragonborn have a standard height of around 6 feet 2 inches. They weigh about 300 pounds or more. Their scales are red, copper, rust, similar shades to that. Their eyes are shades of red and gold. Again, very different from the various colors and things like that that you got when you were a Bahamut Dragonborn. They also have no tail. They have 3 fingers, 1 thumb, opposed to the 4 fingers and 1 thumb that they had as Bahamut Dragonborn. I didn't really say that, but I don't know why I even wrote that. But just some differences there. The other thing to note is I have to go into more detail because these Dragonborn, kind of like how Bahamut's Dragonborn are steeped in the lore of Bahamut and Tiamat and their Dragonfall war that they have going on. These guys are also steeped in history that the Forgotten Realms kind of kicked up, and it's not history that's like obscure, but it's a little complicated. So bear with me while I explain this. So in negative 31,000 DR, Primordial tossed an ice moon at the world of Bree Torel. To spare the planet, kinda, the hidden god Ao stepped in and he pretty much stepped in and split the world in two. He split the world in half. One half was Torel, the planet that we know as Forgotten Realms with Faerun and all that other cool stuff on it, and the other one was Bree, and Bree was placed in a separate place, and the Primordials are the ones that took over that world. And it was to kind of create this peace. The gods had Torel, the Primordials had Bree. However, once the spell plague happened, a large chunk of Bree was displaced into Torel, called Return Debris, and on this piece was it was called Return Debris, and on this piece was the Dragonborn Kingdom, or part of the Dragonborn Kingdom, and thus the Dragonborn were returned to Torel for the first time, kinda. So, if that sounded confusing, pretty much Torel and Bree used to be one planet during the Age of Thunder, right? During super, super ancient times, when Bree was split, the gods split it in half, gave one half to the Primordials, one half to the gods, and a long time after that, like super, super long time after that, at the beginning of 4th edition, the spell plague happened when the goddess Mystra was killed or assassinated. The weave collapsed. All these terrible things happened, and Bree and Torel started to displace one another. Mas Tekka from Torel was displaced with the returned Bree. Other places were returned from Bree into the land of Torel. Cities and kingdoms were completely crushed during that time and replaced. The landscape of Torel was dramatically changed during 4th edition because of this. And during this time, the Dragonborn were a group of individuals that were brought back from there, and their culture and everything like that. So it's not like they are Dragonborn from Torel that just happen to be different. They did come from a different place, which does explain why they would be very different. So, yeah, in 4th edition, 4th edition Dragonborn don't actually know how they came into existence. They remember how they got to Torel, but they don't remember who created them. They don't know. Some believe that it was dragons, some believe that it was gods, but none of them actually remember. Dragons in the world that they came from ruled over all of Bree, and the Dragonborn were one of their slaves. So in Bree, there was only Dragonborn, humans, and dwarves, and Jinsai, I think. But yeah, they used all of those people as slaves. So even though it's been like 100 years, so after the spell plague, it was so what was it? Fourth edition, like when you start playing it, picks up about 100 years after the spell plague happened. I think I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 100 years after the spell plague happens, and they just still really hate dragons. Like they have not gotten over how messed up the dragons are, and they still hate them. So the idea that the platinum dragon would have created them does not sit well with them, and not many of them even believe that. They also live as long as the average human. The odd thing about the fourth edition Dragonborn, yeah. So the really, really weird thing about the fourth edition Dragonborn is that they don't mention how they're born, or reborn, or created. It never says that they're hatched. It never says anything like that. So it's super weird. So with that, all that said, let's go into the fifth edition. There's nothing different about the 5th edition Dragonborn and the 4th edition Dragonborn, to my knowledge. Now, if you guys know that there's something leering out there that I'm missing, please point it out in the comments. I don't know any major differences between the two of them. They look almost exactly the same. They have the exact same shades of color that they can be, the exact same eye colors. The only difference is that 5th edition hints that they have dragon blood, and that they're hatched, which is interesting. But that's really the only difference. But it never mentions anything from a Bree. It doesn't mention the Bahamut Dragonborn. So again, it's another separation from the other two editions. So when you look at everything I've just said, from 4th edition to 5th edition to 3.5, what you get a bunch of Dragonborn that look like they're not connected. You have the Bahamut Dragonborn that are very different from the 4th edition Dragonborn, and you have the 5th edition Dragonborn that don't even acknowledge the 4th edition Dragonborn in their history, right? So you have what would seem like in each edition of Dungeons and Dragons, they have separated the Dragonborn from the previous edition and not paid homage to the previous edition. It's not like elves, who, like, you have the Sun Elves and the Moon Elves, and they're pretty much the exact same going from one edition to the next edition. And they always try to pay homage to, like, the names of them, where they came from, and so on and so forth. The Dragonborn don't have that. They don't have a direct lineage that's obvious and plain to see. But here's the problem, right? This is what started me down the path to my conspiracy theory. There was a tweet to Ed Greenwood. If you don't know, Ed Greenwood is one of the people that really worked on the Dragonborn, where he responded to a question that said, is there a connection between the Bahamut Dragonborn and the 4th edition Dragonborn? And his answer was, yes, there are. No one human or Dragonborn remembers how. Just a few very old dragons. The trick, getting them to talk. Boom. That changes everything. That changes the whole game. Because what it says is there is a connection between the 3.5 Dragonborn and the 4th edition Dragonborn, which obviously means that there needs to be a connection between the 5th edition as well. So, this is where things start to get pretty awesome. So, to unveil this mystery of how all of the Dragonborn are connected, we have to go into the history of the Forgotten Realms itself for more. So, for most of the history, I used several different books. One of them being the Grand History of the Realms book, but I also, some history was in the Races of the Dragon book. There was some history in there. There's also history in the Dragons of Faerun book, and there's also history inside of the Forgotten Realms campaign guide from 4th edition. So there's a bunch of history all over the place in all those different places. Those are the books that I mainly used. If you know of any other places that I could have found that information or maybe more information, let me know in the comments down below. But let's get into it, right? So in the Grand History book, it states that in negative 31,000 DR, the Ice Moon was tossed, and we all started early, like that I told you all earlier, right? That we all discussed earlier Sorry, I really gotta blow my nose. Sorry about that. Okay. So, in that time, the ice moon was tossed in a thing called Tearfall, right? And it goes also that Bree and Terrell split into two alternate planets. But in that same year, the Grand History book also goes into detail, or I wouldn't say detail, it also states that in the same year, thousands of dragon eggs hatch all over Terrell. About 1,000 years after that, and negative 30,000 DR, the first flight of dragon happens, where the dragons pretty much destroy everything, and like all the old civilizations, and took over everything. So, which makes sense if, I mean, can anybody really imagine tens of thousands of ancient dragons and the amount of terror and power that they would have? That's a little bit ridiculous. Um, so, yeah, about 1,500 years later after that, you have the Dragonfall War that starts up between Bahamut and Tiamat, as one of their followers kills the other, and it triggers the war, and it's pretty much been fought up until this day. So this last bit is very important because if you remember, Bahamut's Dragonborn come about during Dragonfall. They come about during the Dragonfall War. And even though the war still wages today, the war didn't. The war did pause in negative 1,071 DR after Tiamat was killed, which means we can easily assume that the first Bahamut Dragonborn were created between the first conflict between the years of 29 negative 29,500 DR and 1071 DR. Um, so yeah, we have a little bit of a gap there from when the first Dragonborn probably existed. So that's still a pretty big and pretty sizable gap, but we can shrink it down a bit more because we know that Bahamut only used the Dragonborn in order to combat Tiamat's dragon spawn. So it would make sense that when she created her first dragon spawn is about the same time, either the exact same time or a little bit afterwards, that the first Bahamut Dragonborn would have been created. So going into that book further, going into the Grand History of the Realms book further, you can see that the dragon spawn were actually created in 24,500 or negative 24,500 DR. And again, this narrows it down just a slight bit because that gives us negative 24,500 DR all the way until negative 1071 DR. So now some would argue that you could also narrow down the timeline even further. And the way that I assume people would argue this is because inside the Races of the Dragon book, they talk about some lore, and one of the first lore is called, I think it's like the first Dragonborn or something like that, and they talk pretty much about a human that used to live in this village, and the village is next to a dwarven settlement and a elven settlement, right? And it's a human village, and the guy leaves and he becomes a bard, and he comes back, and his town is ruined by the dragon spawn, and he prays that he can get justice, and the platinum dragon appears, and he turns into a dragonborn and exacts vengeance, and blah 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 blah. The problem is, so what we could get from that, and the reason that some people would probably argue that we could get it down further is because elves didn't actually come to Faerun until about negative 25,400 DR. Dwarves didn't get here until about 16,000 DR. and it took them about 1,000 years just to get into Faerun and start to make settlements and stuff there. So you could assume that the first Dragonborn weren't created at least until after 16,000 DR or 15,000 DR if you're considering that the dwarves had to actually live in Faerun. You can condense it down even further because that means that if they had a village, they weren't necessarily barbarians and they had good relations. So you could go all the way down to a bunch of different histories and a bunch of different times to try to figure it out. Here's my problem. The story also mentions that the village existed at the base of the Camdeline mountain. After searching through the book, sorry. I'm always sick when I do these videos. Kind of annoying. But yeah, so after doing a lot of research, I couldn't find the Camdeline Mountains anywhere. And the other thing is that this is folklore, so it could change. It could have been that it was just a human, and a lot of things about this story could have changed. So it is my prerogative to dismiss it. If anybody else would like to keep this, and maybe that makes sense to them, that's fine. But for me, it didn't really make sense to depend on lore or folklore specifically, which is typically verbally passed down from one generation to the next and changes based on the context of their environment. So it's really hard to gauge whether the dwarves were added after they came in, whether the elves were added after they came in, if it really was a human, maybe it was a dwarf. If it really was an elf, maybe it was a human. Back and forth. There's a lot of things that are not solid about that folklore. To me, just as far as time goes, right? Using it as a time base is hard to use. So I kind of discount that. But here's the thing, though. And here's the thing to really think about. Abrel and Turel were separated in 31,000 DR during Tearfall, and dragon eggs hatched in the same year. So was Turel and Abri split before the dragon eggs hatched or after? And if the Dragonborn would have been created between the time of 24,500 DR and 1017 DR, how could there be Dragonborn and Abri before they were created, or if Abri was separated before the Dragonborn even came about? Right? So there's a lot of inconsistencies there. Here's my theory. My theory is that Bahamut, for one reason or another, right? I could theorize, but I don't have any proof why he would have done it. But for one reason or another, created the Dragonborn before the Dragonfall War. Those Dragonborn were not sterile and could breed, and because at the time only humans were around, he only used humans as the base. When Abri Turel was split, those Dragonborn were carried over with maybe thousands, maybe hundreds of dragon eggs. To support my theory, if we look back at Ed Greenwood's tweet, he says, humans and Dragonborn don't remember, but the oldest dragons do. The trick, getting them to talk. Humans and Dragonborn don't remember. What a curious thing to say, right? Why not just say the Dragonborn don't remember? Why include the humans in that at all? So I think the human bit was a clue or a hint. I also think the bit about the oldest dragons do. And I think the reason that he said the oldest dragons do is because the only dragons that would be capable of remembering what happened are dragons that were around so long ago that they would extend the they would be the most ancient dragons in all of existence. Because they would have been around during the first flight of dragons, before the first flight of dragons, actually. They would have been around 1,000 years before that. And there actually is a dragon that is that old. So in fourth edition, there's a dragon. I can't remember his name. I didn't write it down. I'm doing this part off the top of my head because I just came across this. There is a dragon who is actually a Draco Lich, and he is the ruler, or was one of the big rulers, or has the most ancient kingdom of a Bree. And his kingdom got transported into Returned Abri during the Spell Plague. But again, he's a Draco Lich. He's bigger than any dragon. Huge. He's a gargantuan dragon. There is no dragon that is bigger than him, and he has magic that no dragon has. It is no dragon knows how old he is. People call him immortal. So, here's the thing. If there is a Draco Lich who can't die, and no one knows how old he is, and he's bigger than any other dragon, in my opinion, I think it's safe to assume he could have been around when the dragons killed the primordials and took over Abri. So when he says only the most ancient dragons remember, it can't be any dragon that lives in Terrell, because they all just hatched then. But a dragon that's old enough to have hatched in Abri and see the Dragonborn existing alongside them would have remembered. But yeah, so that's my idea. The other thing is that the other thing that kind of supports this is, even if you went back to that folklore, right? Even if we just discount the age of it, the first Dragonborn was a human, right? So even if the folklore was passed down from person to person, right? It's arguable that even if you trace it all the way back, it's interesting that the two greater races, right? The dwarves and the elves weren't considered to be the first Dragonborn. A human was. Now, in the grand history of the realms, one of the first entries talks about the Age of Thunder. And inside of the Age of Thunder, it talks about how there are no other races. There are ancient races called like the creator races, but elves, dwarves, goblins, kobolds, orcs, none of those known races exist except for humans. Humans are the only ones that exist in about negative 35,000 to about I think when the elves got there, I said was 25 something. So for a long time, it was just humans and the creator races, and the creator races kept killing themselves off. So it makes perfect sense to me. It makes perfect sense that if you go back to as old as that legend could be, humans would have been the one to pass it down. And as humans came into contact with dwarves and elves, they would put those beings into that story as well. Or maybe dwarves and elves put themselves into that as they told that story, so on and so forth. But again, it's okay if we want to discount that too. Fair is fair. So, yeah. The other evidence that I have towards it is the height of the Dragonborn. So if you remember, I was telling you that the Bahamut Dragonborn are about 2 inches taller than whatever the height was of the race before them. Dragonborn inside of 4th edition, or inside of 4th edition and in 5th edition, are about 6 feet 2 inches. That is very specific. Around 6 feet 2 inches. That means that inside of the books, when you look at humans, it says humans can range from 5 to 6 feet. So if the older humans were on the taller side, around 6 feet, and the Dragonborn are around 6 feet 2 inches, that means or could mean, I should say, it could mean that when the humans transformed into Dragonborn, they grew those 2 inches and they were around that height, which is why the Dragonborn maintained that height throughout all of their evolution. Um, I also think that the Dragonborn. So, sorry, I lost my place on my notes here. Um, so yeah, my theory is that the Dragonborn were carried over from a Bree, reproduced and evolved for about 1,000 years under the harsh treatment of dragons, and became the Dragonborn of 4th edition and 5th edition. I can even explain the disconnect between 5th edition and 4th edition. So in 4th edition, the Dragonborn have kind of like a kingdom that they're working on, but although 5th edition doesn't necessarily mention it, they talk about clans of Dragonborn. It's the Dragonborn, and it's only like a 10-year window, so it's really hard to kind of make sense of this. But I think what ended up happening is that the 5th edition Dragonborn focused more on the clan aspect and not on the kingdom aspect of these guys. I'm hoping that one day they make a book that explains what happened in connection to the 4th edition. It's also possible that they're trying to distance themselves from what happened in 4th edition as much as possible, which is why they don't talk about it. But they don't outright deny it either. So 4th edition and 5th edition can be connected and explained as the 4th edition Dragonborn, because they weren't getting enough support from uh, the outside world. The outside world kind of viewed them as they didn't really understand them. They broke up into clans, and the clans made their own way in the world. But that's just a theory, a D&D theory. um, so let me know what you guys think. I know this was kind of a long video. Hopefully it was entertaining to listen to and see me go through this process. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have your own theory? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Bye.